is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China's top diplomat Wang Yi preparing for important talks with EU officials amid tensions over a $350 billion trade deficit. He's just wrapped up discussions with his Belgian counterpart in Brussels. Japan stands its ground in the face of Donald Trump's threat to impose higher tariffs, with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba vowing to protect national interests. Now, Indo-Pacific security in focus as Quad nations launch a critical minerals initiative to counter China's growing influence while flagging tensions in the South China Sea and over North Korea's missile tests. Beijing braces for heavy rains as emergency measures kick in, while experts warn of mountain floods and landslides in northern China. Also in East Asia tonight, Chinese shoppers are turning to local labels, forcing foreign brands to rethink their sales strategy and play catch-up. Now, some parts of South Korea are seeing a swarm of love bugs, and nope, it's anything but romantic. Warmer weather has these black insects, well, literally bugging people, so much so that complaints are skyrocketing. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is set to meet with EU leaders, Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas and European Council President Antonio Costa in Brussels today. Now, the top Chinese diplomat met with Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever yesterday. Both sides have pledged to boost ties and build trust. Mr. Wang said that China and the EU should enhance communication and deepen understanding, while also urging the bloc to jointly safeguard multilateralism and the free trade system together with China. Now, Ross Cullen here joins us live now from Paris. Ross, first up, what's likely to be on the agenda for this meeting between Mr. Wang and his EU counterparts?
Yeah, there's lots on the agenda, Ateli, at this meeting, which will be beginning this afternoon, Europe time in Brussels. The high-level meeting will be between Wang Yi and his EU counterpart, Kaja Kallas, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and certainly international relations will play a large part of what will be on the table for discussions. The war in Ukraine and the recent war between Iran and Israel will be on the table, and they'll be laying out their differing positions on Ukraine. Certainly, they'll need to talk about the overall picture when it comes to geopolitical tensions as well, international economic upheaval, and China calling out what they see as, quote, rampant bullying behavior. They didn't mention the United States by name, but certainly there could be no doubt about what the target of that criticism was from the Chinese Foreign Ministry leading up to this visit by Wang Yi. Also space potentially to talk about Asian issues like Myanmar. China has been accused of undermining ethnic groups in the country, also the illicit jade smuggling trade in Myanmar, and Taiwan. Recently, the EU's top representative to Taipei did say that the EU and Taiwan are natural partners in countering hybrid warfare and also protecting underwater cables.
So, Ross, do you think the EU is looking to perhaps shift its stance on China, especially with the US tariffs looming? And also, what are some of the hurdles?
Yes, we're only a few days away now. The July the 14th is when the pause introduced by the European Union on its countermeasures against the United States still linked to the original tariffs imposed by the Trump administration in April, when that pause runs out on July the 14th. So China and the European Union possibly seeing this a chance for more alignment between Brussels and Beijing when it comes to international trade, when it comes to multilateralism. There are, however, some obstacles they'll have to clear first. And remember last year, the European Union imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports coming into the European Union, and in retaliation Beijing imposed tariffs on cognac exports going out from the European Union into China. There are also complications when it comes to geopolitical issues like Ukraine and the trade deficit between the European Union and China. But both sides will be hoping to use this week of meetings with Wang Yi in Brussels today, then going to Germany and coming here to France at the end of the week. Both sides using this week of meetings to try to push for closer alignment. Telly?
Many thanks for that report. Ross Cullen live in Paris. Indo-Pacific security is at the forefront as foreign ministers from the US, Japan, India and Australia conclude their wide-ranging talks in Washington. Well, the Quad has announced the launch of a critical minerals initiative to counter what it views as China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. Well, the critical minerals sector is currently dominated by China, although Australia has in recent weeks touted itself as an alternative. Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier highlighted the importance of diversification of the supply chain.
And there are many topics that we can work on and focus on. One that I've personally been very focused on is diversifying the global supply chain of critical minerals, not just access to the raw material, but also access to the ability to process and refine it to usable material. It's critical for all technologies and for all industries across the board.
Well, in the joint statement, the Quad expressed concerns over what they called dangerous and provocative actions in the South China Sea and condemned North Korea's ballistic missile launches as destabilizing. Now, they also called for a ceasefire amid a worsening crisis in Myanmar and also reaffirmed ASEAN's efforts there. Now, for more insights on Quad and its concerns over China, we are joined now by Collins Chong. He's Foreign Affairs Security and Strategy Analyst at the University of Malaya. Welcome, Collins. First up, I thought to get your perspectives from the Washington Quad meeting. What would you say are the key takeaways beyond the critical minerals initiative we've mentioned? And what are the messages they are sending to both regional allies as well as China?
I think it sends a very pivotal and powerful message to both allies and, other partners around the region. We can see how, despite the distractions in the Middle East, in Europe, in Ukraine, and of course also internal frictions among Quad members, we have seen also how the critical need under Trump 2.0, he wants, actions, he wants promises, not merely rosy pictures or utopian projections of how Quad needs to, advance in this changing, geoeconomic and geopolitical dynamics in the region. So we have seen how, this sends a very strong message to allies, even non-Quad members, including South Korea and Philippines, also in courting regional members and as a frontier containment bloc in, deterring further Chinese actions in getting more regional partners in the war against, tariffs, in the war against, Trump, and also in getting more, friendshoring capacities of ensuring that US is here to stay, despite all the perceptions and perspectives on the tariffs, on the actions by Trump, on whether, Trump will be reliable in terms of, getting these defense overtures and support. So this sends also a very powerful message of, reassurances to Taiwan. And also, as you can see through the summit, through the joint statement that is of critical importance for Quad members to realign with the overall agenda of,
So, Collins, I hear what you're saying. You're saying that they are sending out powerful messages, but there are also this internal fracture within the Quad bloc. But they did put out this push forward this new minerals initiative, right? And they did lay out some broad goals, but not a whole lot of detail was being revealed. On that front, what is your take? I mean, is it just purely symbolic, or is there actually some strategy, a concrete strategy behind it?
There is, of course, a concrete strategy because Trump knows best on what's needed to ensure that, in terms of burden sharing, of course, you need Tokyo to do its part. You need, of course, New Delhi to do its part. And, of course, the review of AUKUS, we can see how, despite the talks of, the future of AUKUS under Trump now, it is of great importance for not only to the U.S. national interest, but also, of course, to reassure regional allies that, the importance of AUKUS transcends beyond the security needs of Australia alone, and it can also complement the needs of Japan, the needs of India, and of course the needs of other US allies in the region. And we can see also the needs for allies, especially Tokyo and New Delhi, to play their part in increasing their defense spending. Of course, now we can see that the push for Tokyo to increase its defense budget to 3 to 3.5% of the GDP. So it is of great concern now, not only to Washington but also to other allies, also showing a parallel and two-pronged approach by Trump for this summit to ensure that other allies will need to step up, and in terms of burden sharing capacity, they will need to also show their sincerity and to move beyond the rhetorics of the past in terms of putting the tariff measure as one of the pretexts in the long-term interplay of the negotiation tactics with Washington in terms of how to go about.
So,
in
Collins,
terms of this
I just want to pick up on what you talked about Japan's defense, right? Washington, they're pushing Japan to spend more and more on defense. But, with its economic headwinds, the constitutional limits, for instance, can Japan actually deliver what the Quad expects in real security terms?
We have seen also how the fate of the Camp David summit now, Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, and the formation of the Squad now. And we have seen also the losing momentum of the golden age, of the new golden era of Tokyo-Washington ties since February. And of course, we can see how Ishiba is now trapped between meeting domestic demands and pressure, and at the same time to ensure that how Japan moves forward in facing these three-pronged threats from Pyongyang, from Beijing, and from Moscow, and ensuring that Washington still stays on his side, and the need also to get Trump to be on the same line. And this is how it is of great importance for Washington also in seeing how Japan needs to be reined in, and to ensure that it's not falling under the gameplay of Beijing in courting Japan now under Ishiba in terms of forming this new venture of regional resistance against the tariff measures. So we can see that the new dynamics in play, and how Trump realizes the importance of getting Japan on his side in facing not only the threat of Beijing, but also knowing that the capacity to deter Jong-un, to deter Pyongyang's threat, lies predominantly with Washington, with Trump's greater leverage. So this is how this tariff is going to play out. And Trump knows that Japan has no choice but to rely very much on Washington, despite its overtures to Southeast Asia, Ishiba's visit to the region, defense and friendshoring diplomatic clout that we have seen over the past couple of months now.
Okay, so Collins, in light of the Quad's effort to diversify its supply chains, I'm curious to know what you think in terms of the countermeasures should we expect from Beijing?
We have seen how now he has moved forward in terms of his conventional approach in the South China Sea, and as I've argued, knowing the limited timeline that she enjoys now, in terms of the capacity to act and to react, and of course on his move on Taiwan, and of course the greater leverage now that Washington enjoys under Trump, and of course this is how it's going to shape up in terms of the regional dynamics, and knowing that the only pretext that Beijing has now will be to use the current tariff measure to push back against Washington's presence, and to use that as a pretext to court New Delhi, to court Tokyo and Seoul away from the network of Trump, and to use all this as one of the non-conventional approaches to ensure that economically it will be better off for Seoul and Tokyo to remain at the periphery of Beijing in the long run. But on defense and security, it will try also to test the water further, and of course knowing that he has limited timeline now before the revival of Washington's defense dominance. And of course, also now it will be a critical timeline for Xi also to ensure that from New Delhi to Tokyo to Seoul, the extent of the impact of Washington's drive to reassure them will be will hinge on the efficacy of Beijing's current track and timeline, and this will also create further risks of entanglement.
Quite a few pertinent
Taiwan.
Points you have made there, Collins, but I'm afraid we have run out of time, and we'll have to pick up this conversation sometime down the road. Thanks so very much.
Sure.
Collins Chong, Foreign Affairs, Security and Strategy Analyst at the University of Malaya. We are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan's Prime Minister points to Tokyo's investments after the US threatens higher tariffs. We explain how they're linked after the break. Plus, Japanese car makers hike prices in the US as they struggle to absorb increased costs. again. You're watching East Asia tonight. And it is now time for Business News with Roland. And once again, it seems like tariffs in focus.
Right. Two allies, Japan and US, seem to be at an impasse with a deadline fast approaching. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba says he is determined to protect his country's national interests in the latest comments after President Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs of up to 35% on Japanese products. Now, that's higher than the 24% levy that the US president announced in April, which has been put on pause until July 9th. Mr. Trump says he will not be extending the deadline for Japan.
What I'm going to do is I'll write him a letter, say we thank you very much, and we know you can't do the kind of things that we need, and therefore you'll pay a 30%, 35%, or whatever the number is that we determine, because we also have a very big trade deficit with Japan, as you know.
Mr. Trump wants Japan to accept US-grown rice, a demand that he described as, quote, an easy one. But Japan is standing its ground. Prime Minister Ishiba said in a public debate with other political party leaders that Japan is the largest investor in the US and that Tokyo will protect national interests with focus on investment rather than tariffs. The Nikkei 225 opened with a sharp sell-off with uncertainty about trade tariffs lingering. It recouped most of its losses through the day with the prospects of Fed interest rate cuts providing markets a floor. But despite ending in the red today, the index has risen nearly 11% since April 2nd, when Trump unveiled his reciprocal tariffs. Kate Fisher tells us what message President Trump is sending as he piles the pressure on Japan, a key US ally.
Well, he's showing once again that he will take a hard line with countries, even as the foreign minister of Japan is here in Washington, D.C., meeting Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. This can only have made those negotiations a little bit more tricky. Donald Trump there on Air Force One saying that essentially he'd be willing to increase the tariff on Japan even further if it didn't open up its markets to things like US rice, which he says should be an easy thing to do given that Japan, he says, has a rice shortage and the US is ready to supply it to them. He also has a real issue over the car industry, those autos and auto parts, the pillar of Japan's economy. But Donald Trump wants to make sure that it's a more fair playing field. He says that that is where the biggest part of the trade deficit, the trade imbalance with Japan exists. And those are the two main sticking points, I think, in these negotiations, which seem, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, to be nearly over.
Let's discuss this further. Giulio Pugliese is a lecturer in strategic communications at King's College. He joins us live from London. Giulio, very good to have you on the show. How serious is this breakdown in trade negotiations between Japan and the US?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of Trump's braggadocio to arm twist a deal. The problem, and this is the conundrum for Japan, is that there are upper house elections scheduled for July 20. And public opinion polls clearly show that the Japanese electorate is against the concessions to Trump's bully tactics. So it actually sells to withstand Trump's pressure. And it is good politics for Japan ahead of the upper house elections. That being said, it is also true that there are reports that the trade negotiator for Japan, Akazawa, the Minister for Economic Revitalization, who is very close to Ishiba, Akazawa is scheduled to do another quick blitz trip to the United States over the weekend, according to reports. The issue would be, however, what kind of meetings does he secure and what kind of prospects for real negotiations will he get in terms also of give and take from both sides, including from the United States.
So with this upcoming meeting, you think we might get a narrow face-saving deal before the July 9th deadline, or is that window effectively already closed, do you think?
It is hard to tell because clearly the US president has used very harsh words against Japan. He described Japan as spoiled. He doesn't even remember the name of the prime minister, who Trump still calls Mr. Japan. As your earlier segment shows, Japan does need the United States clearly in terms of deterrence vis-à-vis China. So the relationship is clearly twisted in favor of the United States, which has more leverage in many ways. At the same time, however, I'll go back to the earlier point that domestically it doesn't sell. Making too many concessions to the United States. And the United States might actually be very careful what it wishes for, because it might just get it, meaning, but it might get at the upper house elections, far right-wing populist parties, more nationalist parties, mounting the wave of anti-Trump, anti-US nationalism, and this will actually in the medium run, be against U.S. interests altogether. So I imagine that the negotiations will probably be aimed also at making clear these kind of scenarios to U.S. counterparts, to stress that the Liberal Democratic Party and Prime Minister Ishiba is really perhaps Trump's safest bet in terms of negotiation partner.
Giulio, despite all the posturing, is there a potential silver lining here looking forward? I mean, for example, could this pressure force Japan to, say, accelerate its agricultural reforms or even diversify its import mix?
It is tricky because we are talking about a process that is going against the very foundation of free trade, doing without most favored nation principle, doing without effectively the WTO rules, having a 10% baseline tariff that the United States would like to keep, not unlike the only trade deal that the United States has managed to seize, which was with the United Kingdom, against the free trade rules. It kept the 10% baseline tariff, and the United Kingdom conceded to those requests. And the problem is that this is unsustainable because Japan, we should remember, was already arm-twisted back under the first Trump administration, along with South Korea or Canada for this matter, to actually do a deal with the Trump administration, with the idea that this was effectively going to stick. And now we get even more tariffs, more arm twisting. So the problem is indeed that this is unsustainable because effectively, by caving in, you actually allow for potential more arm twisting and pressure from what is effectively a bully, and that is the United States government under the Trump administration. So this is why it is hard to predict what the Japanese government might want to concede in terms of opening up structurally its agricultural market and whatnot to the United States. A degree of tokenism is going to be at play, but real structural reforms under real pressure and effectively bully pressure, I think it's unlikely because it's going to be unsustainable.
Giulio, we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you for those comments and thoughts. Giulio Pugliese, who is lecturer in strategic communications at King's College. Japanese car makers have been raising prices and preparing to boost American production as they reach their limits in being able to absorb the impact of tariffs. Japanese automakers initially kept prices the same after the tariffs were imposed. According to data from Japan's finance ministry, the unit price of cars from Japan fell about 20% on year in May. The figure showed that Japanese automakers had been trying to absorb the cost of tariffs. But as costs climb, Nikkei Asia is reporting that automakers may shift production capacity to the US. And I'll be back later with more business news, Otelli.
All right, we'll see you later then, Roland. That note, we are going to zip out for a short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, the Chinese capital on flood alert as it braces for heavy rainfall that's submerged large areas of the southern region. And Japan updates its disaster response plans in anticipation of a megaquake that could kill hundreds of thousands. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. There will be no extension in the tariff pause for Japan. That's according to US President Donald Trump. But Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is standing firm on rice. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi preparing for talks with his EU counterpart just after discussions with Belgium, with promises of stronger ties and more trust. The Quad Alliance agrees on a minerals initiative as talks in the US focus on countering China's influence, tensions in the South China Sea and North Korea's missile program. And Ishan Garg reports from New Delhi on the significance of the Quad's condemnation of the Pahalgam attack.
Well, this is a significant milestone for India's diplomatic efforts as officials, including Indian members of parliament, India's foreign minister, and even the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, to some degree, they have been involved in a massive diplomatic outreach across the world to try and convince India's partner countries and allied countries that India's attack on Pakistan, the military strikes that it carried out on May 7th, were a retaliation to the Pahalgam terror attack that took place in April 22nd. And we have seen India rally a coalition of like-minded nations around the world to condemn terrorism, not only in India but across the world. And we have seen wordings like terrorism in all its forms must be condemned and must be tackled. And this is the similar kind of wording that we are seeing in the joint statement that's been released by the Quad foreign ministers. What's also interesting here to note is that this joint statement, which includes a paragraph, a quite strongly worded paragraph condemning terrorism and asking countries that are part of the United Nations to work against terrorism in all its forms, stands diametrically opposed to India's similar efforts to have this sort of statement included in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's defense ministers meeting that took place just days ago. There, India refused to sign the joint declaration because it did not include a condemnation of terrorism. And that SCO is an organization that is widely seen as one where China holds a lot of heft. But on the other hand, we are now seeing in Quad, where India, Japan, Australia and the US, these four countries form this grouping, we are seeing a condemnation of the terrorist attacks. This goes to show how India's diplomatic efforts have played a role, especially coming as India has been consistently refuting President Donald Trump's claims that he played any role in mediation between India and Pakistan, with India stating very clearly, even including the foreign minister stating very clearly that US did not have a role to play. And that has caused some tensions between India and the US. But despite that, we have seen terrorism being part of this joint communique issued by the Quad leaders, showing that India's efforts to corral nations around the world is showing signs of progress now.
Roger Maynard also has more on the Quad meeting, including Mr. Rubio's surprise omission of Australia's defence budget, which has been a sticking point between Canberra and Washington.
Well, once again, a lot is riding on these Quad talks, including critical minerals, but also regional security, economic cooperation and environmental considerations such as climate change. But from Australia's perspective, you'd have thought there's arguably even more at stake. Foreign Minister Penny Wong would have been prepared to outline Australia's position on future defence spending when she met US Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier this morning. But Minister Wong said it didn't come up. She said Secretary Rubio didn't raise Australia's defence budget with her. Instead, they discussed their partnership and the ways in which they work together. She said they obviously talked about the AUKUS agreement and the benefits that it gives all three countries, but not Australia's defence budget. Now, that's a surprise because this is currently one of the main points of difference between Canberra and Washington, which wants Australia's defence budget increased from 2% to 3.5% of GDP. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is not ruling out an increase, but insists Australia will not have the figure set by somebody else. President Trump isn't happy about this, especially as he's persuaded most European leaders to up their defence budget to 5%. And commentators here fear the difference of opinion between Albanese and Trump is straining relations between the two countries. The Prime Minister makes the point that Australia already offers defence facilities to the US and is paying big money to Washington as a down payment on those nuclear-powered submarines, which it should get under the AUKUS deal. But that may not be enough to convince Mr Trump, who has yet to have a face-to-face meeting with Mr Albanese. To add to the diplomatic tension, the Australian Prime Minister is tipped to visit China later this month for a meeting with Xi Jinping. So Mr Albanese could find himself walking a political tightrope, anxious not to offend either nation in these uncertain times.
Now, my colleague Grace Shin spoke with Gordon Flake from the University of Western Australia about the Critical Minerals Initiative and reducing dependence on China.
It's very significant given the relative size and economic heft of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Australia is important because we actually are the source for many of the core minerals there and have a lot of the expertise involved with that. In fact, today there's only one commercial scale rare earths processing facility on the planet on land outside of China, and that's a West Australian company, Lynas, and a mine here that does this processing in Malaysia. So we're already a lot of the way there. When you combine the investment capability, the demand, and the might that you have in the US, India, and the United States, I think we're going a long way there. As to how quickly we can do that remains to be seen. It's difficult to do so on a market basis because China has largely cornered the market. And so if governments are willing to invest in this, it'll happen. If we're counting on corporations to do it on a profit margin only basis, it's a much more difficult proposition.
And the Quad has numerously expressed its initiative to reduce dependence on China, and it also expressed concern over Beijing's growing provocative actions in the South China Sea. So how unified and effective is the Quad grouping likely to be in deterring China's growing assertiveness in these disputed waterways?
Well, look, on the one hand, it's good that the foreign ministers met. They met on Secretary Rubio's first day in the office. The fact that they're meeting again relatively soon after that gives you an indication that the partnership continues. But you've kind of put your finger on the point of one of the issues there is that they all have slightly different interests. And so while the foreign ministers meeting condemned terrorism, they didn't specifically mention Pakistan. While they condemned the North Korean nuclear program, they didn't highlight the immediate linkage to what just happened in Iran. And while they laid out a critical minerals program, they didn't specifically name China. When it comes to the South China Seas, they reiterated their longstanding commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. They continued longstanding statements about not having any one country change the status quo by force. And they called for peace in the South China Seas without specifically calling out China. So this is four very important countries looking to cooperate together without necessarily going over to the more sensitive issues for individual members of the Quad.
And speaking of individual members and their respective demands, India's stance on terror was reflected in the Quad statement, but it wasn't in the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So does this signal hardening positions between the U.S. and China-led blocs on India-Pakistan issues? And what does this mean for India?
Well, look, India has long made a point of not choosing and pursuing its own interests. So India does have interests in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but that's probably not the format for them to be, condemning Pakistan, given the leadership role that China plays on that and China's support for Pakistan. Ironically, the United States also supports Pakistan, but has been quite unequivocal in condemning the terrorist attack that took place in recent months. And so in this case, I don't know that you can say one is the winner, one is the loser, one is stronger, one is the other. They both have different purposes and different groupings, and I think you're going to see India continue to pursue both avenues.
Another geopolitical flashpoint worth noting is the war over in Ukraine. And given North Korea's continued missile launches, cyber attacks, what new strategies or tools could Quad deploy to addressing these escalating threats, especially since Pyongyang and Moscow have been deliberately and actively showing strengthened military ties?
Yeah, so this is an area where it's significant that India joined with Japan, the United States, and Japan in expressing concern about North Korea's nuclear program, because India, in this case, is a little bit more ambivalent given their longstanding relationship with Iran and given their longstanding relationship with Russia. So that condemnation is significant, but it didn't take that next step to say, obviously, there should be consequences for North Korea supporting Russia in Iran because India is a bit conflicted. So the Quad really is about the art of the possible. It's how these four countries can work together without necessarily crossing red lines or areas of insecurity or uncomfortableness, if you will, on the other parties in the Quad.
Fiji's Prime Minister says that China should not be allowed to gain a military foothold in the South Pacific. Mr. Sitiveni Rabuka was speaking at Australia's National Press Club in Canberra, where he hit back at suggestions that China could turn its influence in the region into a permanent security presence. Mr. Rabuka told reporters Fiji would not welcome this, and China's participation in Fiji's development should not affect how they interact with Australia, New Zealand and America. The Fijian leader also said aid and development should not be offered to Pacific nations with strings attached. China has invested heavily in the Pacific, building government offices, roads, hospitals and bridges. Several island nations have cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan in favor of China in recent years, including Kiribati and the Solomon Islands. Beijing has issued a flood alert as the Chinese capital braces for a fresh round of heavy rainfall to hit the region today and tomorrow. Rainfall is part of a broader weather system affecting the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, with moderate to heavy storms expected. Some areas may receive up to 160 millimeters of rain. Beijing's Flood Control Office has instructed relevant departments to implement emergency measures, monitor the downpours and ensure the city's effective flood prevention. The cities are part of the 14 regions on alert for widespread rains. Following days of persistent heavy rainfall, multiple regions across China are now entering a crucial phase of post-recovery. Local governments and volunteers are now intensively carrying out cleanup operations to restore normalcy and ensure public safety. But with more rain still expected in the coming days, authorities and workers remain on high alert. Japan has stressed that much more needs to be done for the country's earthquake preparedness in the event of a so-called megaquake, where an estimated 300,000 people could perish. Now, existing plans are believed to be able to reduce that number by just 20%. The government, in a bid to further enhance survivability, has updated its disaster plans with new measures. 16 municipalities across half a dozen prefectures have been added to the country's designated disaster prevention areas, bringing the total to more than 700. Areas likely to be hit by tsunamis will have to conduct regular evacuation drills, and inspections as well are to be carried out to ensure disaster plans have been implemented. Now, infrastructure resilience will also be boosted with fresh investments. Underscoring the urgency, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said it is important for society to come together to save as many lives as possible. Now, experts believe unearthed a megaquake in the area known as the Nankai Trough has up to an 85% probability of striking within the next 30 years. The predicted damage could cost Japan up to $2 trillion. The country experiences frequent tremors and volcanic activity as it sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire. In the past 2 days alone, a series of undersea earthquakes ranging from magnitudes 4 and 5 struck a remote region between one of the main islands of Kyushu and Okinawa. And for more on Japan's megaquake risk, do check out this explainer on our website, cna.asia, or on our mobile app. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists, says that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue and that a successor will be named. The statement comes ahead of his 90th birthday, and it follows speculation that there would be no successor when he dies. Now, the Dalai Lama is regarded as a separatist by China's government. He says the India-based non-profit organization he heads will possess authority to identify his reincarnation in accordance with past tradition. Beijing authorities say the reincarnation needs the approval of the Chinese government.
中国政府实行宗教信仰自由政策，颁有宗教事务条例和藏传佛教活佛转世管理办法，依法保护活佛转世这一传承方式。达赖喇嘛的转世必须坚持国内寻访、经凭撤迁、中央政府批准的原则，遵循宗教仪轨和历史定制，按照国家的法律法规办理。
Tibet is designated as the Tibet Autonomous Region within the People's Republic of China. A government in exile exists in Dharamshala, India. Coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese consumers flocking to local brands gives Enter the power to dethrone Nike's market share in the country. Plus, could this be the biggest comeback in K-pop? BTS tells their fans what they've been waiting for. Hello again. As promised, Roland Lim is back with more business news. And what do you have for us? Markets?
Well, Tilly, let's recap first market action elsewhere in East Asia today. Muted trade for mainland Chinese markets. The Shanghai Composite closing largely unchanged, 3,454 points. Second was the Shenzhen component down by 0.6%. Markets in Hong Kong playing catch-up after returning from a holiday. It is up 0.62%, ending the session high, of course. And the Chinese currency, well, that is also relatively flat, 7.168 to the dollar. China's top leadership has vowed to clamp down on chaotic, cutthroat price wars and to accelerate efforts towards a unified national market. It's also pledged to weed out outdated industrial capacity. The renewed push signals Beijing's growing concerns over deflationary pressures and a clear intent to boost domestic demand and to spur consumption. One analyst shares his take on Beijing's latest policies to clamp down on price wars.
Well, basically speaking, when we look at all the industries, we think mainly this policy is aiming at the automobile companies. Of course, there are many other companies involved, but basically that's aiming at automobile companies because so many automobile companies in China are competing severely with each other and new energy vehicles are selling so cheap. So that's causing some chaos in the market. So that's why the government is stepping in. But overall speaking, we still see a very promising growing of China's consumption market. Tariff is a bad thing. I mean, no one really wants a tariff, especially a tariff that you can't predict. I mean, it's 10% today to 100% or 200% tomorrow. It's really making Chinese businesses worry about the U.S. market. But the good news is that this is not starting from today. I mean, it started from the last period of Trump administration. It's almost about 10 years ago. So many of China's companies have prepared a lot for this tariff war. I mean, we've been aware for a decade. If you check out the export of many of China's companies and the overseas investments that many Chinese companies are making, like the home appliances companies, they have deliberately avoided the U.S. market in the past decade. So a lot of trade has already been diminished between, China and United States. But a lot of trade has been rising between China and other economies, like especially the ASEAN countries. So, this is what's going on. I mean, the U.S. starts the war, the trade war, and people avoid trading with them.
Global brands are losing ground in China as shoppers turn to local brands, forcing some to rethink their sales strategy and play catch-up with their Chinese rivals. For many homegrown brands, the situation today is a turnaround from as recent as 7 years ago when foreign brands dominated the country's consumer market. But over the past few years, Chinese brands have marketed themselves as having high quality and design tailored to local tastes. In the sportswear industry, Li-Ning and Anta are two of China's biggest sportswear brands, and they are seeing rapid growth globally. Nikkei Asia reports that in 2024, ANTA grew its global market share to 3.38%, up from 2.92% in 2022. At the same time, US brand Nike's share dropped from 17.06% to 15.72%. Drone maker DJI is another notable example, currently holding around 70% of the global drone market. But there is also a nationalist reason behind the rise in Made in China, and that is Guachou, which is the chic wave driven by largely younger generations. They believe in helping China's image while choosing products that are cheaper, at the same quality, or even better than their foreign counterparts. South Korea's June inflation came in above what the market was expecting. The consumer price index rose 2.2% in June from a year earlier. The inflation figure was higher than the 2.1% by economists polled by Reuters, and higher than the 1.9% seen in May. June's figures is the fastest acceleration for consumer inflation since January this year. Check on how the Korean markets ended for the day. The benchmark Kospi index down 0.47%. The Leiden Tech Kosdaq is down 0.4 as well. And the Korean won also weakened slightly against the greenback, 1,358.63 to the dollar. And that's it for business. We'll tell you.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Now, parts of South Korea now seeing a blanket of black insects due to warmer weather. Swarms of love bugs, or honeymoon flies, called such because of how they attach to one another when they mate, were first detected in 2022. Since then, complaints about them have skyrocketed. Hordes are present in Gyeang Mountain in Incheon City just a few days ago. Well, they covered observation decks, rails, stairs, and trees. Workers have been dispatched to help clear public areas of these insects. Although love bugs do not transmit diseases or sting humans, their sheer numbers have caused complaints from residents to skyrocket. Seoul says more than 9,000 complaints were logged last year, compared to around 4,000 in 2023. Now, since 2022, they have been appearing in the South Korean capital and neighboring regions every summer. Well, no surprise, the world of K-pop in a frenzy after supergroup BTS says that they will release a new album and go on tour next year. Well, the group announced their official comeback in their first live stream with all 7 members in nearly 3 years. Their agency says that the 30-minute event drew more than 7.3 million real-time views. Group member RM says that their album will be out next spring and they'll travel to the US this month to begin preparations. Their last album, Proof, was the bestseller in South Korea in 2022 with nearly 3.5 million copies sold. Now, the megastars put their music career on hold 3 years ago to begin military service, something that's required of all South Korean men due to tensions with the North. Before their military service, BTS generated more than $4 billion in yearly economic impact. That's according to Korea Culture and Tourism Institute. And that accounts for roughly 0.2% of South Korea's total GDP. Now, the band made its debut in 2013, spearheading a global K-pop craze with lyrics and social campaigns aimed at empowering youngsters. The global success boosted South Korea's soft power and opened the doors to other K-pop acts. Their industry now valued about $9 billion annually. And that wraps up East Asia Tonight this Wednesday. Thanks for watching.